Thank you, everyone, for listening to Soul Talk with host Jeremy McDonald, the author of Peace Be Still. You can check out more about our shows or about Jeremy at soultalkradio.org and jeremymcdonald.net. And now for our show.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to Soul Talk here on Mother's Day. It's going to be a special show on Mother's Day today. We have a wonderful guest, Tricia McCannon, online, and I'm just pretty excited because on Mother's Day we were going to be talking about the return of the divine Sophia, healing the earth through lost wisdom teachings of Jesus, Isis, and Mary Magdalene. And I was just talking to Tricia very briefly before the show started, and she's been traveling for, quite a bit but we're very excited about having her on the show, and everybody just send lots of energy of love to us here on the show, and let's co-create a wonderful space. How are you today, Tricia?
Oh, good morning, Jeremy. What a pleasure to be on your show, and what a perfect day to be talking about the divine feminine.
That's what I was thinking when we booked it. I was like, oh, that was synchronicity.
Yeah, it is. And actually, after the radio show today, I'm going to be taking my mom out for lunch with my sisters, and then we're taking her for a pedicure, and I'm hoping we're going to get to go see a movie or something. So, you know, I know everyone out there's probably got a similar kind of day plan with friends and family and loved ones, but it's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Absolutely, and thank you for coming on such an important day. I'm really enjoying your book, and it's really opening my eyes up to things that I've been studying for pretty close to 20 years now, and of course you learn new things every day. And I really want to touch base. I want to go into the story of how you got here. I think I'm just pretty excited about asking about the discoveries that you found about biblical teachings, and I'd have always known that they were tainted and I guess changed. I guess manipulated would be the best words. But you even take us back even further than what I thought, which was Constantine, and about how our teachings that are supposed to help bring peace and love and compassion to our planet were taken out of these mystery teachings. And,
yeah, it's a very deep subject, and as you know, Return of the Divine Sophia that just got released about 6 weeks ago through Inner Traditions is my third book, and so as you can sort of tell from reading that book, it has been a long journey, and one that I think with all of us, these things unfold gradually. So, you kind of have it in a compressed form where I first encountered, the teachings of the divine feminine in my 20s. And, of course, I had absolutely no idea. Like everybody else, I was raised in the Judeo-Christian, male patriarchal God. And like many of us, I was trying to reconcile the incredibly beautiful teachings of love and forgiveness and non-judgment of Jesus, which I very much subscribe to, with the God of the Old Testament, which was kind of like, the Ten Commandments are a pretty great moral set of laws. Don't lie, cheat, steal, kill, or, take your neighbor's wife. That's pretty good for not getting you in trouble. But then there were all these discrepancies I kind of couldn't figure out, which was like, we just gave you the Ten Commandments, but now we want to send you in to, in fact, steal the land of the Canaanites, murder every man, woman, chicken, pig, and goat, and, sanction it in the name of God. And so that kind of punishing patriarchal dominator model God did not seem to me to have anything to do with the God of the New Testament, which was really a God for all people everywhere. And so I think, like a lot of people, I had struggled with that from the time I was a child because, as I convey in my books, my dad was Baptist, my mom was Methodist, and eventually we became Episcopalian, believe it or not. And so, in the Baptist church, it was hellfire and damnation. And that was scary to me, and as it is, I think, to a lot of kids. And the Methodist church was a little better, but there was still lots of, judgment and hypocrisy and chauvinism. And then we finally got around to the Episcopalian, which I actually loved that one because I think of it as Catholic light. It has a lot of the beauty and the ritual of Catholicism without the shame, blame, guilt, and anger that seem to have come through the centuries of, this Inquisition. So, that was beautiful and certainly created a holy space. But like you, Jeremy, I always had kind of felt like that there was a bigger picture out there. And like so many people that are our listeners, I didn't really know exactly how to go about finding the answers to these nagging questions that were in the back of my brain. And that's really what my 3 books, Dialogues with the Angels, and then my second one about Jesus and the 30 Lost Years and his deep involvement with the spiritual mystery traditions that had been on the planet going very strongly for some 4,000 years before he was ever born and some 400 years after the resurrection. Those are all things that pretty much were suppressed and covered up and largely obliterated from the collective consciousness of the public's knowledge. So most people don't even know there were mystery schools. They don't know what they taught. They don't know how they taught. They don't understand that there was actually once a time when men and women lived in partnership models with each other, that women were honored as true equals of men, and that for the first 200,000 years of life of Homo sapiens, and that's actually as far back as archaeologists think we go, that there were earlier versions, of course, of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, but that Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens came up around 200,000 years ago. And so for most of that period of time, until really about the last 3,000, God, or the Creator, was worshipped as the Divine Mother, because everybody could observe that it was women that gave birth. So, of course, who would have birthed the universe? The Divine Feminine. And eventually that morphed to where it was the Divine Feminine and Masculine, because, in most cases it does take a man and a woman, or a male and a female, if it's the animal kingdom, joining together to produce new life. So, of course, the Divine Feminine and Masculine. And then eventually that became the Divine Son and the Divine Daughter. And with, unfortunately, about 2,500 years ago, we really lost the Divine Mother, the Divine Daughter, and the Divine Son. And, of course, with Christianity, we got the Divine Son back, but what the heck happened to the Divine Mother and the Divine Daughter? And so consequently, our societies tend to grow out of our cosmological belief systems or our theological underpinnings. So if in our theology we've taught that God created man and woman's just sort of a appendage that came out of man's rib, she's kind of there to serve him. And this has sort of been the Adam and Eve story that was created, just totally created, by the Hebrew priest around 500 BC. And with the creation, the acceptance of that, which we, bought lock, stock, and barrel with Christianity, ever since then we've basically had a male patriarchal dominator model running most of the world. And, of course, we're starting to begin to bring some balance back into the picture, at least, in countries like America and a lot of Europe and so forth. But, you look over in the Muslim countries, you have still got this completely dreadful dominator model happening where, men can do what they wish and women get murdered for going out and seeking an education or not having their heads covered or not having many layers of clothes on.
Yeah.
You there,
yeah, that's
Jeremy?
interesting. Yeah, I'm here. I was just processing what you were saying, and I never realized how even in the Muslim countries, I knew that it was obviously very male dominated, and but I have two friends that actually moved over to Morocco about a year and a half ago, and they're moving back next week. But they even as kind of a more progressive Muslim country, I guess the way to put it is that they have a roommate over there where he actually told them flat out he won't do housework. He has a girlfriend that comes in once a week and cleans his house. And so I was like, they were so dumbfounded that,
and I'm sure, of course, that there's lots of beautiful Muslim people out there, but in general, the Muslim religion grew up around 600 A.D. Like Christianity really kind of, even though Jesus was born around 7 B.C., we had, of course, the Essenes, then we had the Gnostics, and we had about 24 different sects of the Christian faith that were honoring different aspects of the teaching. Some honored the balance between the male and the female. Some honored more Jesus as the Son of God. Some honored Jesus as a man who had become a completely enlightened being. Some honored Mary, the mother. Some honored Mary Magdalene. So, you had a lot of different sects, and those all sort of began to be persecuted and wiped out when Constantine was around 312, A.D., was really fighting to hold together the Roman Empire. And, of course, as we know, the Roman Empire was up for about 750 years, and that's kind of a long time. And it went through a lot of bumps along the road. It was a republic for a long time, and then we got those Caesars, and some of them were good, like, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar had their good points, but then you had some crazy ones like Nero and Caligula. So by the time we get around to Constantine, there were many different gods and goddesses being honored throughout the Roman Empire, but the Jews were really ornery and not letting go. It was like, our way, we have one God, you must worship our God. And then, of course, some of the Christians, some of them were very enlightened, but others were really poor, uneducated people who had bought we are the privileged class, even though obviously financially or in terms of nobility bloodlines they weren't, but they had bought into that. And there are numerous reports of one group of Christians, being incited to go murder another group of Christians that were more forgiving. So, I mean, it was a crazy situation. So, of course, Constantine was trying to consolidate power, hold his empire together, and in the end of the day, he kind of brought the Jews in, he brought the Christians in, and he said, let's codify a system of religion. We'll make this an official religion, so we're not going to be, feeding any more Christians to the lions like they were doing during Caligula and Nero's time. And so they began to try to merge different religious faiths. For example, Constantine was what was known as Sol Invictus, which is the victorious sun. So he was the head of the Mithran order. Well, the Mithran order had a lot of good things about it. It was primarily started in Persia, kind of made its way over to Rome, and it was very strong among the warriors, the Roman warriors, because it was about strength and sacrifice, and it actually harkens back to a much earlier time of Osiris, actually, the killing of the white sacrificial bull, the Apis bull, which represents, again, the Christ figure from a much earlier time going back thousands of years. So they kind of merged a lot of those things, and then the Correctorites began their work of editing the books and the Gospels that had been kept, taking out the others, calling them apocryphal, and then making it illegal for anybody to even have these other Gospels or these other books, which is, of course, how the Dead Sea Scrolls were buried and the Nag Hammadi texts were buried. The Nag Hammadi text, as you probably know, were discovered in Egypt in 1945, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. And there was about a 50-year basic silence where this pontifical commission was hired, as they say, to protect God's Word and God's Church, which meant that the translations that they were discovering of these original Gnostic teachings, which were probably around 50, 60, 70, 90 A.D., really earlier than any of the Greek translations from the Hebrews that we had, which were more like 200 A.D. So these went back closer to the core of what was really being taught by Jesus. And so, of course, it was absolutely stunning for these men to read books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas, because the story that was unfolding was very different from what these men had been conditioned to believe for, 1,600 years. And the things that were being said in those books some of them were beautiful. For example, in the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of my favorite, Jesus says, anyone who drinks from my mouth will become like me, a Christ. In other words, the word Christ actually, the one Christ that we know, comes from the Egyptian Christ, Krst, which is what the followers of Osiris were called. And it means an anointed one. In other words, one who has been anointed with the Holy Spirit or with the divine blessings, and also with, there was actually an anointing ceremony for the priest or for the kings or for the queens or for the initiates. And, of course, we know the story of Mary Magdalene, who understood that Jesus was going to his death on the cross, who anointed anointed Jesus' feet and head with the very expensive spikenard. And this was really, she even said, whenever this is told, any writings come out about her, let this story be told, because that story marked her really as a high priestess, which of course she was. She was trained in the esoteric traditions, not only among the Essenes in Galilee, like Mary the Mother was, and Joseph of Arimathea was, and Mary Salome and Mary Jacobi and many of Jesus' disciples, but she had also gone to Egypt and spent many years in training as a priestess of Isis. And in fact, the woman with the alabaster jar, as they tend to call it, in many of the depictions, the vase or the vase that she's holding literally looks just like the anointing vessels or vases that they used to anoint the pharaoh, or what in Egypt would be known as the Horus king. So her anointing of Jesus marked him really as her recognizing that he was the embodiment of the Osirian energy, an earlier manifestation of that Christ energy, or the Horus energy. And, of course, some of our listeners might not know who Osiris and Horus are, but, if we kind of back up from all this big picture, all this smaller minutia to a bigger picture, what we realize is that, we're souls, we're having an experience on the planet Earth in mortal bodies, and we come down here and we kind of have amnesia, most of us. We don't really remember where we came from, who we really are. We kind of come down to this planet. There's no manual that says, hey, you really come from the higher worlds, and you have incarnated down on this planet, and you have agreed to a certain set of lessons, and you're going to love and you're going to suffer, but you're going to have the opportunity to make the right choices again and again, and you're going to run into difficulties and challenges along the way, and when this whole life is done, you'll go back up to heaven, and we'll see how you did on your report card to see what kind of progress you made. Since most of us don't remember that piece, from time to time, these profound avatars and beings from the higher worlds will choose to come down through those dimensions into the physical world and take birth. And they're both male and female aspects of these beings that come in. And certainly Jesus was one of those profound expressions of the Creator, of the divine. And so was Mary Magdalene, which of course many of our listeners, if they haven't really followed this stuff, they may go, Mary Magdalene, wasn't she like the prostitute? But, when we start really looking at the history, and this is part of why I wrote this book, the only reason we think she's a prostitute is because as the male patriarchy took over the church, they looked around for competition, and they saw that the biggest competition was not just these other Christian groups that they wanted to wipe out, including like one called the Marionettes, meaning not puppets, but followers of Mary. And but what they discovered was that the ancient teachings were honoring both the masculine and the feminine, the Divine Father and the Divine Mother. So the thing people did not want to give up was honoring the Divine Feminine. They did not want to just sign up for this male punishing God. They wanted an aspect of the Godhead or the Goddess head that was kind and loving and forgiving and compassionate, who loved the animals and loved the earth and taught us to love one another. And, of course, I'm sure Jesus was very much aware of both aspects, as I relate in my book with some of the teachings that were really taken out. But, you know...
And I think it can be confusing, don't you? Because the...
Pardon?
The Bible... I was just saying the Bible can be somewhat confusing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just saying the Bible can be somewhat confusing because... some places it says the God is very forgiving, you know, the story of the prodigal son returning and stuff like that. But then the other parts of it, it talks about, you know, the punishing,
wrath.
And stuff like that, the wrath of God. And so, you know, people can get really confused on that and get disenchanted with
It's totally true, and this is one of the reasons why, you know, in the arc of the Divine Sophia book, we start out, as you know, with a shamanic story, and it's a true story. It's actually, that story continues through the whole book, but it's really how I came to be initiated within some of these very deep and profound and sacred spiritual paths. And this really began, truth to be told, when I was 19. But that particular story that begins is in my 20s, where I have a very powerful dream that I have gone back to school for my master's degree, and I wake up and there's all this sort of vertical extraterrestrial symbol language on the walls, and I'm trying to remember it, but I fall back asleep. And when I wake up, I only can remember one symbol, which is a circle with a dot at the center. And I somehow know that this means the beginning of all things and the ending of all things, although I have absolutely no idea how I could possibly know this. But I go to the library to see if I can find some reference. And so while I'm there, the student assistant comes and gets me and says, there's a phone call for you at the front desk. And I'm like, well, for me? Nobody even knows I'm here. How can there be a phone call? So I go to the front desk and pick up the phone, and there's a woman on the other end, and she says, is this Tricia McCannon? And I'm like, yeah, you know, who's this? And she said, we've called to tell you that your dreams are real. And, of course, I was stunned. And I said, who is this? And she said, we're from the priestesses of Isis, and that's all we're permitted to tell you at this time. And then she hung up the phone. And then I woke up, and it was a dream within a dream with obviously two messages, the symbols and the priestesses of Isis. And, of course, like most people, I had no idea who the priestesses of Isis were. You know, I had been attracted to Egypt, of course, my whole life, like many people. But, you know, it's quite a puzzle over there to try to figure out what all those strange hieroglyphics and symbols mean. And so, you know, I had no idea what this meant. But then 2 months later, I was to actually have an encounter with one of these high initiates, a priestess of Isis, who was to become my shaman teacher. And that, of course, is how the first 5 pages of The Return of the Divine Sophia starts. And I go and visit this teacher, and the things that she says that day really shift my reality. And I realized that my guides really wanted me to study with her. And but, of course, I was a scaredy cat, like, you know, many people. I was, you know, trying to fit into the world that I had been brought up in. I had a very traditional family, Christian family in the South. My older sister's married to a preacher, for heaven's sakes, and they're fundamentalists. My mom and my little sister were evangelical Christians. I mean, my mother did speaking in tongues and laying on of hands, and so, you know, I was already, you know, practicing, you know, soul travel and studying with these masters from the Far East, so I was kind of already on the outer fringes of, acceptability in the Christian world. So I was like, oh my God, if I go study the goddess, they'll think I'm a witch or something. They'll burn me at the stake. So of course, I kind of backed off from that, but I realized that the time would come when I would study. And so, as you know in the book, there were many things that had to happen before finally I returned to this amazing teacher and said, it's time. And, of course, she was like, and you better do your homework. So, as you know, this book kind of toggles back and forth between my historical discoveries, which are very grounded information about archaeology and anthropology and the real story about how the Old Testament got written. Most of us don't realize that the Old Testament was not even codified into its current form until around 100 BC. And probably 60% or more of it was actually written by the priest of Yahweh between 100 BC and maybe 500 BC, where they were attempting to create the illusion of some kind of historically linear timeline to, let us say, create the illusion that this was a unified group of people. And certainly there were Semitic people all over the Middle East, from, Syria and Lebanon and many different places. But, there were not Jews at the time of Abraham. I want to just point that out. They claimed Abraham as their, founding father, but he was actually from the city of Ur, and he was an initiate. He did become initiated in the Melchizedek order, and then he went to Egypt, and he wound up marrying, or he wound up studying at the Temple of Heliopolis, and that's how his name went from Abram to Abraham. And then you kind of move along, and you've got the story of Jacob, and then you've got the story of Joseph, and if you remember Joseph in the coat of many colors, he wound up in Egypt, and he wound up marrying the daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis. So once again, very trained in the Egyptian mysteries of the Tree of Life. And then you have Moses, and Moses again was, the story we've been given in our Hollywood version, which comes out of course, the story that the Jews made up in 500 years after the fact. Moses was actually an initiate, a very well thought of, respected priest in the temples of Heliopolis in Egypt, and he had leprosy. And, there's two kinds of leprosy, as you may know. There's the kind that's contagious and the kind that's not. So presumably had the kind that's not because, he was studying away and so forth. But as I relate in my book, the story that was recorded at the time all of this actually happened around 1250 BC is that the Pharaoh at that time, Amenhotep, wanted to see the gods. And he was told by an oracle that he'd be able to if he got rid of or rounded up all the people with leprosy. Because, of course, the Anunnaki gods that were visiting the planet, they weren't interested in capturing leprosy. So he did. He rounded up like 80,000 people, and he kind of gave them their own city west of the Nile. But they were so annoyed and so angry and so incensed that this had happened to them. And Moses became their leader. His name was originally Osiris, which actually is a derivative of Osiris. But he changed his name. He went out and he got 200 other Semitic people that were living out on the outer plains, and 300,000 of them invaded Egypt and basically, killed the priest, desecrated the temples, and took over Egypt for 13 years. And it was 13 years later before the Pharaoh and his son, who was a child when this happened, had grown into a man enough to be able to mount an army of 250,000 people. They were down in Nubia, kind of hanging out and trying to figure out what the plan was. And they eventually came back in and drove Moses and the invaders out. And so, this, of course, is not the story that we've been told at all. In fact, as I relate in the book, the 5 books of Moses were not written by Moses at all. I was stunned when I discovered this.
I was too when I read.
Pardon?
I was just laughing because I read it in your book, and I was like, really?
I was the same. When I did this research, I was like, well, why are they called the 5 books of Moses? I mean, that comprises the Torah, the first 5 books of the Jewish teachings. It's part of the Quran. It's part of the Christian Bible. I mean, those 5 books, they now know from biblical scholars that 40 to 60% of them were created or composed between around 900 and probably 650, 700 BC. That means if all those events took place around 1250, 1270, 1280, between 700 and 1200, in 50 years, that's a 500-year gap. And even if they were created as early as King Solomon's rule, around 950 BC, that is still a 200-year gap. That would be like someone asking me to make up a story of George Washington 250 years ago. Well, I didn't know George Washington. I mean, I could make up stories all day long about how he chopped down the cherry tree or how he crossed the Delaware. But, so that's some 40 to 60%, and the other 40 to 60% of those books were not even created until probably 400, 500 BC. That is like, 800 years, 800 years after the fact. That would be like someone asking me to come up with a story from 1200 1,200 years ago. So, I mean...
So about Robert the Bruce or something like that.
Yes, Robert the Bruce, right. Let's tell the story of, Romeo and Juliet in Verona. Well, that would have been 14 or 1500s. But, again, the time cycles. And, I mean, many of the things in the Old Testament were not even written until 100 or 200 BC. And by this time, as I sort of explained in the book, there were at the time of King Solomon, there were 4 major sects: those that honored the Divine Father, the Divine Mother, the Divine Son, and the Divine Daughter. In other words, the male and female balance. And so the priest of Yahweh did not like it. They always wanted the upper hand. So they did everything they could to sort of, sabotage the honoring of the others. And so eventually, after the Babylonian, captivity, if you guys, you might not remember your history, and if you don't, I certainly don't blame you, because for heaven's sakes, I never wanted to really learn this stuff. But in order to uncover the truth, I really kind of had to. So there were 2 kingdoms. Samaria, not Sumeria, Samaria was the northern kingdom. Those were 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 2 tribes of Israel had Judea. And so Samaria fell to the Assyrians around, I think, 722 BC. The 2 kingdoms below did not even lift a hand to help their brothers, not at all. But the 2 kingdoms below, Judea, Jerusalem, fell around, I think around 570, something like that, BC. And so for 50 years, that group was in captivity in Babylon. And then the Persian kings came in, and Persia, conquered Babylon. So at that point, they needed people to pay taxes. And so they said, anybody who wants to go back to their original lands can. We'll underwrite the building of the roads, the towns, the temples, everything. But then, you got to pay us money. And so about a third of the Jews in captivity decided to go back. The other 2/3 stayed in Babylon. And this is the group that built the second temple with the Persians underwriting it. And this is where the priest of Yahweh finally got the upper hand. And this is when they started codifying what we now have as the Old Testament, which is very much a patriarchal document They did not even have the story of the Great Flood until the Babylonians, and of course they created Noah, although there was a being like Noah completely. So that story is probably a true story. They just changed it to a name that suited them. And they also created the story of the Garden of Eden. And that story existed as man and woman being created by the Anunnaki gods, or the Elohim, which is the plural form. So it's the gods. So they turned it into one God. Man got created first. Woman's an appendage. And then they created this crazy story that, we're sort of a derivative. But as I talk about in my book, the biological reality is that all mammals are created female first, every one of us, and that the existence of the male is because of the release of an additional androgen that allows that other chromosome to form. And I mean, from my point of view, great that it does, because we love men. Men are wonderful. And it would be a sad, lonely world without the opposite sex. But the point is that it's a complete reversal of the lie that these dominator model patriarchal societies have used to justify superiority and the suppression of women. And I'm certainly not voting for women rising up and suppressing men. That's just as imbalanced. What I sort of am voting for is that we begin a partnership model. And this is what archaeology has shown us, is that up until about 4000 BC, there does not appear to be any evidence of real big wars and conflicts. There was a partnership model of rulership throughout the Mediterranean. The line of succession passed through the woman. She was the queen and high priestess. Her husband, her brother, they also had power. They also did the things that they needed to do, whether it was hunting or governance or teaching the next generation. And it was a peaceful society. So, what we've come to believe in our version of reality, as we know, history is written by the victors. And so the victors were the patriarchy. So most of us believe that we are a warlike, aggressive race. We must always have war. We must always be suppressing, judging, and controlling one another in this hierarchical caste system. And we don't seem to even believe that the possibility exists that we could have another kind of world, a world of harmony and peace and getting along. And, of course, I say we, people like you and me and maybe many of our listeners, we believe it's possible. But for most of the general public, we've become so conditioned to this continual round of wars and abuse and fragmentation that we just don't even know how to create a new system. We're just on the leading edge now of beginning to think we can have cooperative models of peace and harmony. And if you kind of think about it from the point of view of money, wars make money for somebody, not for the countries that are involved in them, but usually for the people who are selling the weapons. So with the Internet and a lot of the things that we've developed in our time, which are cooperative models, it's actually, I think, a lot more useful if we can find a way to make it profitable for us to all get along and have harmony. Perhaps some of this, the war machine mentality can begin to shift in our world paradigm. Does this all make sense? I feel like we're on the verge.
It does, and actually I got a message from a listener right now, and they said they were just saying, they're just throwing this thought out there. They said, what if the Adam and Eve story was created for the concept of division for the ego? And I think what they're meaning, and this really, it was kind of something I was thinking around the same time, because we don't honor the divine feminine, and we haven't been, our inner world is divided, and so then we can't find peace because we're very, masculine dominated, or masculine egoic thinking, and the warlike and that kind of stuff. So
I think that's incredibly insightful. I would agree with both you and the listener, very much so. I mean, what you're talking about is the repercussions. It's like we accept a cosmology, we accept a theology, and from that, our social systems, our self-esteem, our way of operating in the world begins. And when we have, disowned, as Roger and Ann Woolger, who are wonderful writers that I actually quote in my book, say, it's literally like the Divine Father and Mother got a divorce, not in reality, but in our minds, the children are forbidden to talk about the mother on pain of death or punishment, and consequently we are, in fact, in separation from ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
And that part, if you think about it within us, the masculine part, a couple of years ago I broke my foot, and I fell pretty hard when I did it, and I wound up spraining both wrists, and I got post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, I thought post-traumatic stress disorder was something that Vietnam vets got and war people, and I really had no idea until I got it. But what it really is that we have a neural circuitry in the brain, if you imagine everything lit up. And the right side of our brain and the left side of our body is the feminine. The left side of our brain and the right side of our body is the masculine. And so for me, what happened was my right side of my brain, my feminine, got turned off. And for about 3 weeks, I was just in a dreadful mood until I figured out what it was, and then I learned how to very simply rebalance my brain and turn my circuits back on, which is something really all war veterans should be taught. And it's a very simple thing. They've done this process. It takes like 3 minutes with long-term coma patients, and 9 out of 10 have actually come out of the comas the next day. That's how powerful this is. And it was actually engineered by a brain institute, so it's quite amazing stuff. If anyone's really interested, maybe I'll wind up figuring out a way to post the process on my website. But having said this, it taught me very clearly what the masculine and feminine parts of our brain do. The feminine is the faith-based, positive, optimistic, the glass is half full, I can create my reality any way I want to, it's the intuitive brain, it's the creative brain, it's the endless possibilities, hopeful brain. The masculine brain is the protector brain. It's the survival brain. It's the one, the realist, who takes a look at the situations of the things it can assess now and tries to figure out, within realistic limits what's possible. So in truth, we need both of these brains, because if you just had the feminine, you'd be like happy and joyous but pie in the sky and not very grounded. And if you just have the masculine, you really can only think within the box. You can't get out of the box. You can't, it's a pessimistic, realistic brain. So it's not able to see endless possibilities. It's only able to successfully develop strategies for what it is able to see in its immediate environment. And so you can see how both of them are needed. And so if you only have the masculine brain and you're a warrior and you come home and, you don't know what you're going to do about money or school, and maybe you have a physical injury and, you're having stress from the trauma that you've had, you can sort of see how many of these very good, noble men and women, they can't figure out a way out of the dilemma because the other part of the brain is turned off from falling or injury or the trauma of war itself. And so many of them, after getting mad and being violent and threatening their families because they're just so frustrated and they can't see a way out, I think there's something like 2,500 of these veterans that kill themselves every month. And all that really needs to happen is their brain needs to get turned back on both sides so that they can begin to think outside the box and dream their life at a higher level. But that's exactly addressing what you're just talking about, is that through trauma, accident, war, what happens is we are only operating with one part of our brain. And if we're not dealing with the whole brain, then obviously our choices in life become much more limited.
Yep. We go into a box, I guess would be the way to put it. And
yeah, it is like a box. Right.
Yeah.
It is. And I mean, if I had not experienced it myself for those 3 or 4 weeks, I mean, I very rarely get angry. I'm very, I meditate, so I'm very harmonious and I'm very connected with spirit. As you know, I mean, I'm a clairvoyant. I've done over 6,000 readings. I do a lot of healing work with people. But for 3 or 4 weeks, I was just in such a bad mood. It was like, who is this person inhabiting my body? And, a friend of mine had broken her arm the week before I broke my foot. And she had insurances, and she was going to therapists every single day for the arm, the wrist, the psychologist. And she said, they say we have post-traumatic stress disorder. And I said, well, what's that? She said, well, it's where one part of the brain shuts off. As soon as she said it, I saw it. And I was like, oh, my God, this is what it is. I'm, frustrated. I'm in the box, and I can't see my way out of the box. And that's, normally as a clairvoyant, the way you become a clairvoyant is really you have both sides of the brain fully operational, and you begin to open up the inner spiritual eye. And this is really actually at the heart of the spiritual technology that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were teaching. This is why in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, when the two eyes become one, when the inner becomes the outer and the outer becomes the inner, when the male becomes the female and when the female becomes the male, then you shall see the kingdom of heaven. Well, of course, if you don't understand what the spiritual technology is, the male and female sides of the brain, the two eyes, our physical eyes, become one, the third eye. When the ability to see into the outer world that we all look at every day allows you to open your inner vision so you can look inside, so that the inner becomes the outer becomes the inner. Where you have access to the kingdom of heaven or these dimensional levels within, then we begin to understand how reality is actually shaped and how to awaken our inner spiritual gifts. And, of course, this is something I've spent a lifetime doing. So when this shutdown of my brain happened, I was like, something is wrong. And, of course, I'm sure it happened so that I could pass this information along to other people who may be dealing with some of the same kinds of stresses. And, I mean, it can be anything, an accident, a fall, a trauma. But if, you can just simply turn that circuitry of your brain on. Would you like me to say how to do this for the listeners?
Absolutely. Please. Yeah, please. Thank you.
Well, it's very simple for those of you that are out there. You take your left hand and you put it across both hemispheres of the brain, kind of horizontally at the back of your neck. And then you take your right hand and you spread your fingers and you go to the top of your head and you tap. So one hand, the left hand is across both meridians in the meridian line. And then you are tapping with the other hand both meridians of the brain with your fingers spread, and you breathe. And then you take the tapping, you leave your left hand where it is, but then you take the right hand and you tap your heart. So you're connecting your brain and your heart, your left and your right sides of the hemisphere. And then you just move the left hand up to the next section. So if you kind of have a normal size hand, I mean, maybe if you have a big hand, you can do it in 3 moves. But most of us, it takes about 4 rounds of doing this little tapping. So it starts at the back of the neck, and it goes up across both hemispheres, along the meridian between the 2 hemispheres, to the next section, and then the next section, and then the front section. So all you have to do is breathe, so the breath anchors it, tap to turn the whole brain on, and then tap the heart. Brain, heart, then move to the next section. Brain, heart, then move your hand up to the next section. It's amazing. I do this now when people come in to see me for healings or readings, and they're, disoriented, or they've been on the highway a long time, or they're in an agitated state, that's the first thing. I'll just have them balance their brains. And it's a good thing to get in the habit of doing. In the morning, it takes you 3 minutes. You can do it in the shower, or you can do it in the evening. If ever anyone feels ungrounded, it's a great way to get grounded. If you feel spacey, it's a great way to do that. If you're with someone who's very rigid, and the rigid's going to be the masculine brain, the spacey's going to be the feminine brain. You can begin to balance your own brain. And what it does is it begins to give you access to more of who you really are. So you're not trying to run 100% of your life on 50% of your perceptual abilities. You begin to be able to operate from a more balanced place. Does that help?
That does. Thank you so much. I'd done something like that with EFT before, but that is, I was just kind of trying to do it a little bit while you were talking about it. You can feel that.
It's amazing. I mean, within like 3 or 4 days, it's like, oh my God, I'm feeling normal again. So it's a quick fix, and as I said, they have used it, this institute, with long-term coma patients, and 9 out of 10 woke up the next day, if you can imagine. So this is a great thing for us to know, not only for ourselves, but to help others. And certainly if you know of anyone who's gone through a lot of stress or has gone through battle, share this information, because the more that this information can get out, the more good it can do in the world. And the more possibilities then our friends and family members will have to create a positive life for themselves.
Well, thank you so much for that, but I'm sure that everybody's going to enjoy that and help them. It'll help them throughout their lives. So I know you've been traveling a lot, and you just got back from Boulder, you were telling me.
Yeah, and San Francisco. With the release of this book about 6 weeks ago, I was in Boulder 2 weeks, and then home 2 weeks, and then San Francisco, and I'm home this week, and then I leave Thursday for Arkansas, and the end of the month I'm in New York, and then I go to Pennsylvania to speak. So but I am home now, and so I have people calling and setting up readings and healings and asking if I want to come to their towns. And, of course, I'm happy to do that for anybody who I've just put together a new program on the divine feminine and processes to begin to awaken us to the possibilities within our own lives. So, yes, I'm very happy to talk to anybody who, would like to sponsor me coming in.
So what, your website, I've got it in obviously the description down below, so it's TriciaCannonSpeaks.com.
It's McCannon. I'm Scots-Irish, so it's TriciaMcCannon.com or TriciaMcCannonSpeaks.com, and the spelling of Tricia is Tricia. It's like Patricia, but with no P-A. It's not that really pretty spelling, T-R-I-S-H-A. It's the T-R-I-C-I-A. And then McCannon is just like it sounds, M-C, and then Cannon, C-A-N-N-O-N, Matt Cannon. So TriciaMcCannon.com or TriciaMcCannonSpeaks.com. And, you'll see all of my books. I've got about 35 DVDs and CDs. I have a lot of short YouTube videos that are free on the website. I've got 2 or 3 or 4, 5 to 10 minute audio listens that people can listen to that are free of charge, and then some that are, of course, longer that I have a little nominal fee that I charge for. There's a great one actually on there called Footprints of the Mother. And it was the original recording of the chapter that's in the book, although, of course, that chapter's changed a bit by the time we, got the book out there. But there's all sorts of courses. My mystery school, I've been teaching a mystery school for 10 years, which, as you can imagine, incorporates Egyptian, Celtic, Native American, because, of course, here we are in America, and the goddess teachings. And after 10 years, I'd had so many people saying, do you have an online course? I finally, 2 years ago, have an online course. So now I have students that study remotely all over the world. There are 12 of those classes, and I actually have excerpts on the website with the table of contents and a little excerpt from every single one, so you kind of get a sense of, you take them really in order because they build on one another. But if you order them, what happens is then I see that you ordered them, and I send you like 100 to 150 page PDF, which has gorgeous images and exercises and processes and lots of teaching about those subjects. So there's a whole section on my website on the mysteries. And, you see the drop down where it says online classes, and then you'll see all 12 of those come up. So there's a lot for people to take a look at, and there's lots of things that are free, and then some things, obviously, that I charge for.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful. And it's wonderful to know that we're both of Scottish descent. I named
McDonald. Yes, you. You're a member of one of the biggest clans of all.
Yeah, I went on a big study of them a few years ago, and that was to understand my own heritage. But that's a whole other show, the McDonald clan.
Yeah.
Well, Tricia, I really
Dougal's, the McDonalds, the Camerons, all those wonderful Scottish tribes out there. We love them. Yeah, my mom was a Hayes, and my dad's a McCannon, so both of those are Scots or Scots-Irish with some English thrown in. So, yeah.
My best friend is Duncan. The last name is Duncan.
Oh, that's a great name. I love all that Scottish heritage. It's great. But, most of us also in this country, like I have some Native American thrown in from a few generations, and so Cherokee. And so, really we're kind of like a motley crew here in America. And it's one of the things I think that makes us great is that all the different nations and tribes have something wonderful to share, and maybe only when the blood gets mixed up enough that nobody can, everyone can stop their prejudice. They can say, in fact, yes, it's great to be any and all of these things, because in truth, the soul is immortal. We come in as male in some lives, female in others, black in some lifetimes, oriental in some lifetimes, white in other lifetimes, Native American in others. And when we really begin to get that, we can realize that all the crazy division and prejudice and judgment, is completely has no base at all. We're all in this together.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree. Tricia, I am so glad you came on, and I just want to wish you and your family a very happy Mother's Day and enjoy dinner and the movies. And
thank you so much, and you too. Is your mom still alive?
My mother transitioned in 2012, and she walks with me, though. So I went and had breakfast this morning, and I honored her. And
that's so sweet. Well, I took my roommate out this morning. She's a mother, and her kids are across the country, so I was her surrogate daughter, and I'm going to go take my mom and my sister who's a mom and my other sister that's a mom. I'm not a mom. I have books and DVDs and students and clients instead of having children, but I honor not only the great mother, but all those wonderful fathers and mothers out there in the world who are doing such a wonderful job with their kids.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for
having me,
Jeremy.
Our future conversations, and many blessings. Thank you.
I look forward to it, and happy Mother's Day.
You too. Bye-bye.